We're now joined by Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeeze, the co-directors of Popular Resistance, which, without exaggeration, is one of the leading anti-war movements, organizations in the United States. Welcome, Margaret and Kevin.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Earlier today, on Friday, both Margaret and Kevin took part in demonstrations in the March on the Pentagon, and they wound up at the Washington Post. Tell us what you talked about there.
Well, at the Washington Post, we talked about the propaganda that comes out of, we call it the CIA Post, since Jeff Bezos has a multi-$100-million contract with the CIA through Amazon. It's amazing that an editor of a leading paper would have a contract with the CIA. It's just bizarre. But their reporting is basically in support of war. And their reporting to support a regime change. They did a really propagandistic piece recently on the failure of socialism in Venezuela. They're reporting when we were in the Venezuelan embassy, serving as interim embassy protectors, preventing a U.S. coup there, was totally like they were part of the coup team. So I think we have to take information from the Washington Post and the New York Times and much of the corporate media with big grains of salt. It's very important for people to look to alternative sources of news to really get an understanding of what's going on in the world, because misinformation is more accurate, more common in U.S. media than actual accurate information.
Right. I mean, the Washington Post, it doesn't talk about the fact that the United States is using what are called unilateral coercive measures against many countries, as many as 30 countries, representing about a third of the world's population. They call them sanctions, which implies that this is something legal, but in fact, unilateral coercive measures are illegal under the United Nations Charter. And so they're basically allowing the United States to continue to do these practices, which are killing, just looking at Venezuela alone, a Center for Economic and Policy Research did a study showing that in a 2-year period, the economic coercive measures were contributing to the deaths of 40,000 Venezuelans. Now, this is a form of warfare that seems to be acceptable to people because we don't see the bombs dropping, we don't see the carnage, but the United States is part of manufacturing consent for this type of warfare.
Well, the United States, and in particular its media, as you point out, Kevin, it's not just the Washington Post, however, is it?
That's right.
Does the corporate media have in promoting war and in therefore deflating any kind of popular resistance to it?
Well, they just misreport the facts. They never report on the reality that, as Margaret mentioned, U.S. sanctions are unilateral coercive measures that are illegal under international law. The U.S. is a widespread lawbreaker consistently in multiple continents. Even though both President Trump and President Obama ran as presidents who were going to end U.S. interventions, both have continued them and expanded them. President Trump hasn't started a major war, but he has dropped more bombs on Afghanistan than any president in any single year. So he's not a peace president. He's record military budgets. There's never any debate in the U.S. media about how much we're spending on the military. But if you talk about health care for everybody, we can't afford it. And yet, so this mass spending on war, over $1 trillion if you add all the budgets up, not just the Pentagon, but the Energy Department and other intelligence agencies involved in militarism, it's over $1 trillion. We're spending more than the rest of the world combined. And that's not even debated in the U.S. media. And it's not even debated what that means to us, what that empire economy, that failed empire economy is doing to the economic security of people in the United States.
I think it's really important to look at who is speaking on the corporate media. And we know that, major outlets, CNN and others, hire generals, ex-generals, to come and be their spokespersons on foreign policy. You're not hearing the people who are actually trying to raise awareness of the impacts of our military aggression around the world, the insecurity that it causes. So people are getting a very skewed version of U.S. foreign policy on the corporate media.
Now, we look back to the first Gulf War. That's when CNN made its name, if you remember. Mm-hmm. Live broadcasts of the bombings of Baghdad, which was in 1991. That changed a lot, didn't it, in terms of how people perceive war? Tell me about that.
Well, it glorified it. It made the bombing of Baghdad look like fireworks, and it's led to incredible destruction in the Middle East, the area we call the Middle East, whether it's Iraq, or Libya, or Syria, the threats to Iran, Yemen. It's just disaster after disaster, and the U.S. media glorifies it. They make their name, as you said, CNN made their name from covering it, and that was actually after a response from the people of the world and the people of the United States for the largest anti-war demonstrations in this century. Millions of people around the world said no to the Iraq War. They said no, there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They criticized Colin Powell for his performance at the UN, and so the people knew the war was a mistake, and it's turned out to be a mistake, a multi-trillion-dollar mistake, where millions of lives have been destroyed. Migrants have been created that have flooded Europe and caused political and economic disruption in Europe. The mess the U.S. made in Iraq is a global mess, and we're now threatening war in Venezuela. We're threatening war in Iran. We're encouraging separation in Hong Kong with our regime change efforts. I mean, all over the world, the U.S. Is intervening and causing destruction, even though the people of the United States oppose those kinds of policies.
I mean, wasn't it just recently, or I guess recently in the spectrum, when President Trump dropped that huge bomb,
the biggest bomb ever,
and everybody was calling it "What a beautiful bomb!"
What a beautiful bomb! Yeah. It's so sad that we glorify, and it's bipartisan, of course, Joe. As you know, this is a bipartisan war machine. The Trump administration puts forward a project for the Pentagon, and the Congress expands it. So this is a bipartisan war machine. When Trump talks about getting out of Syria, you hear from both sides of the aisle that both corporate parties are calling for, no, we have to stay in Syria. Why? Because controlling Syria has been a foundational part of U.S. foreign policy since the first CIA coup in 1949. Attempted coup, it failed. But since then, the U.S. has always wanted to dominate Syria because of its geopolitical position and its oil wealth.
Oh, well, there's no question about that. But I want to just ask about how a popular movement against war develops. I mean, maybe we're having a problem. We have too many wars right now. If there was the Korean War, a Vietnam War, in World War II, that was kind of easy to focus. But there are how many different wars going on now? Small, lower intensity wars, perhaps, with drones from Yemen. Yemen is one war that could be focused on. Now Syria. Syria's come back into the news. It was forgotten about.
Yes.
For years. We didn't hear anything in the Western media about that. Although the conflict continued, people kept dying, and the U.S. and Western allies were still involved, as well as Russia and the others, to try to defeat these extremists. Now, I don't want to get too deep into what Trump did, because we're going to talk about that in another part of the program. But is there a problem? There are too many wars to focus the public. How do you get the public rallied around an issue of stopping war or a war?
Well, I think, part of the problem is that it's not being covered in a way, an accurate way. And what's actually happening is that the corporate media has been able to demonize populations of these other countries, and demonize the leaders of these countries. So if you look at, Venezuela, even Senator Sanders is calling, President Maduro, a democratically elected president, a vicious tyrant, which is just completely false. If you look at the Iranian people, we're made to be afraid of the Iranian people. The Iranian, Revolutionary Guard is a terrorist organization. And so this, people are busy, people are insecure. Economically, they're more focused on, their daily lives, and what they're being fed through the corporate media stream is like, oh, it's okay for us to attack these countries because these people are bad, their leaders are bad, and we need to save the poor people from their terrible leaders. And so I think this is a big part of the reason why the anti-war movement has not been strong, but also the period under President Obama was a very disastrous period for the anti-war movement. You know, the blacks typically were very strong anti-war, opposed to war. And then you had these Democrats who, suddenly they were supporting, these quote unquote humanitarian interventions. And so the anti-war movement has been working to rebuild itself really since the Obama administration, since those 8 years.
And I would add that as far as black people goes, Black Alliance for Peace, organized by Jamu Baraka, the former Green Party vice presidential candidate, is doing fantastic work in organizing black communities across the country. There are groups, and interesting about the anti-war movement is when it does come together, it can have an impact. We saw this, with Trump's military parade. And people may remember Trump wanted this big, glorious military parade, something like we see in dictatorships around the world, and people opposed it. In fact, we organized with a bunch of other organizations in opposition to stop that military parade. More than 120 organizations joined together, planning to protest if that parade went forward. And that parade did not go forward. And one reason it didn't go forward is because the budget became too expensive. The initial budget they planned was under $10 million. But by the time the anti-war movement started to organize and say we're going to be there, what we're going to do, they had increased the budget significantly. In fact, just the budget to deal with the opposition was $13 million. And so they ended up stopping that military parade, which would have glorified militarism. And when the Syrian war under Obama was being talked about, we were able to slow that down and stall that for a while. We've been able to stop a war with Iran. It's not just the anti-war movement itself, by itself. We are a groups that come together and express a national consensus. I don't think the problem is too many wars. The problem is too many misleaders in our government and our media. People are misled, as Margaret said, about who these presidents of other countries are, what kind of governments they have, and this false humanitarian war concept that was developed when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And so we have a bipartisan war machine, and we need to build the opposition to it, and we are building it. I mentioned we just recently held a event in New York City, a series of events, the People's Mobilization to Stop the War Machine and Save the Planet, which united two things. First, international law. This was during the UN General Assembly, pointing out the U.S. as an international law violator that needs to be held accountable, and also united the anti-war movement with the climate movement, because the military is the biggest polluter on the planet. The Pentagon produces climate emissions that equal 140 nations. We can't confront the climate crisis if we don't confront U.S. militarism. So the movement is developing. It is having an impact. We need to keep doing more, keep building it, and that's why it was so important we were part of this protest today in Washington, D.C.
Now, you mentioned an interesting point. When Obama made his red line in Syria, he said if they use chemical weapons, the U.S. would intervene. Of course, there was the accusation that Syria had used the chemical weapons. So there was this enormous pressure on him to intervene. And suddenly, in the British House of Commons, there was a vote against. And then in the U.S., there was this popular backlash or resistance to going to war in Syria.
That's right.
And therefore, Obama threw it to Congress, and they were fumbling with it. And then, of course, the story is Russia came up with the plan to take the chemical weapons away from Syria, and the U.S. Agreed with Russia to do that, and they successfully did that. The UN Security Council certified. But I want to ask you, how was that transmitted to the government from the people? I don't recall millions of people in the street, we're not going to war with Syria, but yet I've always read that message was very strongly transmitted to the government from the American people. How did they do that?
Well, it was really people all around the country who were calling into their members of Congress's offices, and then a small number of activists who camped out right on the corner of Independence Avenue, where between the Capitol and the House office buildings, and kept a visible running tally of where each of the members of Congress stood on the issue. And between the massive numbers of phone calls coming in and the staff, the members of Congress being publicly listed about where they were, members of Congress were coming down to that encampment and saying, "Oh no, change my name, put it on this side, not that side." It became politically toxic for members of Congress to be associated with supporting that.
But in addition to that, there were, I'd say, two ways that the message of the anti-war was transmitted. One, there were dispersed protests across the country involving hundreds of thousands of people. You didn't see millions of people coming to Washington, D.C., but you saw protests throughout the country against the Syrian war. And those protests were used to raise visibility and to get people active and do what Margaret said, calling Congress, writing Congress, confronting members of Congress at town halls. And so that all occurred. The second thing is we have developed in the movement an alternative media, combination of independent media as well as social media. And people during that time period began to learn that we are the media, that if we coordinate our efforts, if we work together, we can reach hundreds of thousands of people. We can reach more people than cable news outlets. And it's, again, dispersed, so it's not as obvious, but there's actually research that's been done now that shows when independent media outlets echo each other, they change the national debate. And so we shouldn't think of ourselves as powerless. We have power, and we have to learn to exercise that power more effectively. And of course, because of that, you've seen the Googles, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, and the Twitter feeds all going to challenge social media and limit the ability of us to get our message out. But that just requires us to do more work, to organize and coordinate our efforts. And so on Popular Resistance, we're constantly, every day we put out 15 or so articles that people can get on a daily news summary, and they can get those articles and become the media themselves. They can spread that news. They can share that in their networks, whether through social media or in meetings with activists in their communities. So I think it shows that we are having an impact. We can have an impact if we continue to build that media, those social movements, and those independent websites and organizations. We can influence the outcome of the political narrative.
Well, let me ask you, let's go back to that Syria example. Were you surprised, either of you, that this happened? Was this spontaneous reaction against going to war in Syria, or was there some organizing effort put into this?
There's always organizing effort putting into it. But it's spontaneous in that people who are involved in these issues come together and say, we got to do something about this. So that's a spontaneous reaction to the threat of war in Syria. We have to do something about this. We're on regular conference calls with numerous anti-war organizations planning various events for the future. It ranges not just from opposition to militarism and war and budgets, but also regime change against the illegal, unilateral coercive measures. So people who are in these organizations are constantly talking to each other, trying to figure out how to advance the movement, what our next campaign is, and the Syrian campaign was one of those campaigns.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised by what happened? About how many people came out against that war in ways that we just discussed, by sending letters, by calling Congress?
I would say, somewhat surprised, and of course it had an impact, and then President Obama found a way to get around that anyway, and support, fighters inside of Syria, but
he didn't intervene. The U.S. did not intervene in the war.
At least not openly. He did it with the CIA. But I would say that a surprise is an interesting question because, whenever we organize an event or even a campaign, we don't know what to expect is going to happen. Right. It can be 10 of us showing up at a street corner, or it could be thousands. When we organized Occupy Washington, D.C. during the Occupy Wall Street era, we worked on that for a year. Before Occupy Wall Street even occurred. And then after Occupy Wall Street happened, we started the Occupy Washington, D.C. event, and we had 10,000 people show up. When we were organizing that, we were expecting maybe there'd just be 50 of us. And so we never know. And we started the activity to protect the Venezuelan embassy. Recently, when we were in the Venezuelan embassy for 37 days, we're now facing federal prosecution for that effort. When we were there, we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how the media would react. We didn't know how the movement would react, how the opposition would react, how the government would react. All these are undecided, impossible for us to predict. But we move forward with the goal of every positive step we take is a step in the right direction. And if we show organization, we do our work to mobilize, if we show courage in moving forward, some people will join us and we'll grow. And so every step is a process. So yes, Obama ran as a so-called peace president. He had raised an expectation. So when he threatens war with Syria, people were outraged. And so I'm not surprised people responded, and I'm not surprised that Congress responded, because they know the people oppose war. They know people oppose the military budgets. They know that these interventions are wrong. And so when we organize, we are showing them what the people stand for. It's our job as people in the United States to tell our government we oppose this militarism, wars, and interventions.
Without the corporate media, would they be able to go to war? Because what you're just saying is there is a natural, almost a natural anti-war feeling in this population, probably in most populations around the world. So if it was left just to the people directly communicating to their leaders, it might be much more successful. But the corporate media, again, acts as a buffer, or transmits the lies, basically, the lies that were told, let's say, about the invasion of Iraq. The New York Times doesn't set up, make up these things, but they listened, as Judith Miller did, to Ahmed Chalabi, for example. They listened to other people in intelligence agencies telling them what turned out to be wall-faced lies about the existence of WMD, for example. So
Yeah, I mean, if people in the United States were told the truth about the U.S. foreign policy, the truth about the countries, that we're going after, the reasons why we're intervening in those countries, I don't think that we would be successful with this foreign policy. I mean, if you look at it, I think the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who their eyes have been opened to what the United States does have created kind of a generation of folks who are opposed to war. We're seeing it in the problems with the military to recruit new people. They have a serious crisis there. So I think that you're absolutely right. If the people in the United States had the real information, things would be very different.
And that's why the work that Consortium News and others do is so important. We go to Consortium News regularly to get coverage of anti-war issues. Your writing on Ukraine is almost the same as my writing on Ukraine. We're both talking about the Ukraine coup being one of the most open coups in history, the amazing abuses of the U.S. government, and how they put their own the president, the prime minister, the finance minister, Biden's son, Kerry's financial advisor, Monsanto. It was an amazingly open U.S. coup, and yet we don't discuss that in the corporate media. But we discuss it, and we're influencing people. So yes, the media's impact, and so are the bipartisan. Elizabeth Warren, her first comment on climate change in the campaign was worry about the U.S. military bases that are on the coasts. That's her first worry about climate change, the military bases on the coast. Oh my gosh, give me a break. And Bernie Sanders. These are the two most progressive candidates running in the Democratic primary. Bernie Sanders has had to be pushed toward a more anti-war position. He has said nonsense repeatedly about Venezuela, which is really embarrassing for anyone who knows what's going on in Venezuela. To hear what he says is just a real shame to the political narrative. But he has moved significantly on multiple military issues. He's not been voting for military budgets. He's fighting against Yemen. He's
gotten a little better about Palestine.
So he's made some progress, but it's because of people pushing him. People actually protested him in the last election because of his stands on war. We need to do the same with Elizabeth Warren. We can't count on anyone in either one of these corporate Wall Street parties to be anti-war. We need to confront them at every opportunity. We need to embarrass Elizabeth Warren for her comments on protecting military bases as her top climate concern early in the campaign. That needs to be something she's held accountable for.
Well, thank you for your comment about Consortium News, but that leads me to what you said earlier about a study you mentioned that showed that there is, and this is fascinating because I wasn't aware of this, that there is an impact in aggregate, all the alternative media, or anti-war media, if we can call it that, actually has an impact on
On public dialogue.
Antidote to the corporate media. It is getting through. Tell me about that. Tell me more about
Well, it was a Harvard researchers, I guess it was 2 years ago. I think it was about 2 years ago. We covered it on popular resistance, and we can share the link. But the study basically said that when there's an echo chamber in the independent media, when they share similar ideas, repeat them in their various ways, but make the same kind of points, that influences people. I mean, think how many readers, how many readers you have, how many readers we have. We each have tens of thousands of readers, and you may have more than that. And we had many more before they put in place the algorithms that undermined our readership. But some independent media reaches hundreds of thousands of people, and those are people who are influencers, because those people are also in networks in their communities, because they're activist types of people. And so they share that information when they go to their meetings or to participate in their coalitions. And so the influence that we have has a kind of a multiplier effect. And that's what the study showed. When we you don't have to work together. We just do our natural thing of reporting the truth. And then the truth gets out, people share it, and people understand it. And that's how we impact in this polluted corporate media environment. We've got to really build up that independent and social media environment. We all have to think ourselves as media. Think how many people you can reach. I'm talking to your listeners, how many people you can reach on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media, thousands of people. Everyone is each a small media outlet. If you are intentional about how you use your role as an independent media outlet, you can influence the dialogue in the country. So you go to websites like Popular Resistance, Consortium News, Black Alliance for Peace,
Black Agenda Report.
Black Agenda Report, great web outlet. You go to these sources and you get information and share those stories. You are doing important activist work. Correcting the media manipulation is a critical ingredient. All movements start with education, and that's our first and primary function.
All these outlets you've mentioned, including ours, we may have 10,000 unique readers a day, but you add that up, it represents a spark that could set a fire, which is why I think the authorities are so intent on monitoring what you do, and not only what Consortium does, but certainly what you guys are doing, because you're out on the ground actually organizing things. We're just doing journalism here. We're not really an activist site so much. Tell me a little bit about that and your own experiences about being monitored, surveilled, how the movement is a target. It's been, of course, all along, certainly during the Vietnam War protests, but today, what examples can you give us about?
Oh boy.
I mean, I think our biggest problem is, as Kevin indicated, that, Google changed its algorithm, and suddenly we saw our readership decline by 60% because people couldn't find us when they were looking up, when they were doing searches. We know that when we put things out through Facebook and Twitter, that our reach is being throttled. So, those are the biggest impediments that we face. Are we being monitored? Yeah, certainly. I mean, I remember one time when I got a phone call from a Federal Protective Service agent who wanted to let me know that we had put in the wrong location on the on our calendar for a protest that was coming up. We put one courthouse, and he called to say it's actually at this other court. So, and then when we were doing the Occupy movement in Washington D.C., we know that we were heavily infiltrated. We saw people coming in that were trying to throw the protest planning off course, come in at the last minute and say, "Oh, hey, no, everybody, we need to go over here. This is happening right now," and take all our plans and try to divert them, somehow. We see that in every action camp and action, that we do. We know how to look for people that are infiltrating, and what to do when they come in to divert them to something else. But this is a constant, it's a constant issue that we face.
Infiltration is part of the response to social movements in the United States, and it's been that way for more than 100 years. CBS News reported about less than a decade after the 1968 Democratic Convention, which had a mass protest, some people called a police riot, that 1 out of 6 of the people involved in that protest were federal agents. CBS News reported this. Yeah. And that doesn't even count the Chicago police. And we see this in political campaigns. We see this in movements. And Margaret and I did 2 articles on infiltration around Occupy, which are on Popular Resistance. If you look up infiltration, you'll find it there. And in our school, we have a Popular Resistance school on how social transformation occurs. You can see it on the Popular Resistance websites for free. It's 8 classes. We spend a class on infiltration because we shouldn't be cowed by that. We should understand it and know how to respond to it. There are ways to deal with it. There are ways to even turn it to your advantage. But we have to be aware of it and expect it and plan for it. So if you visit the Popular Resistance School, 8 classes, we did that school because we see the 2020s as a decade of major change. Issues are reaching crisis levels. The movement is much bigger now than it was during Occupy, 10 times as big. We cover the movement every day, so we know that. And empire is failing. We're in potentially the last decade of U.S. empire. That's a significant reality. And if we do our job right in these next few years, we can end U.S. empire. It's not serving people in the United States, not serving the people of the world. It's causing mass destruction, and the empire economy is undermining the insecurity of people in the United States. So there's tremendous opportunities, but we've got to educate ourselves. Talking to our listeners as well as us, we have to educate ourselves on how we can be effective, and that's why we did that Popular Resistance School. Help people check it out and learn from those. Take those 8 classes, and we have a lot of reading materials that go with it as well.
Well, you opened up a whole subject that we could spend a program on. No, maybe we'll do that. A program on the what does the end of an empire, this one in particular, look like?
Wow, that's a great question.
So we have to leave that to another show. But if I could ask one more question. You mentioned, Margaret, that the recruitment is in trouble for the military. So many people believe that the reason ultimately Nixon decided to end the draft was because he saw the protests. And he thought that with an all-volunteer army, without people having draft cards to burn, there wouldn't be such resistance to war. We then saw, as we mentioned, 2003, before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, this enormous outpouring that frankly surprised the hell out of me. I covered that. I was working for the Boston Globe then, and I covered the New York protests. I think it was Valentine's Day, it was in February.
Massive.
And then I wrapped in around the world what happened. And I was personally shocked that this outpouring came. 1 million people in Hyde Park in London and in New York and all over the world. So what role does ending the draft have? And would they think about bringing that back? Or the reason why they don't is because they're afraid, again, of the growth of resistance to war.
Well, what we have right now and what is, I think, sustaining the military is we have an economic draft. Who is it that enlists in the military? It's people who really don't see any other alternative, that can't afford to go to college, that are struggling to get a job, and they see this as a way to be able to get those things that they want. I think, without that, we would have an even more significant problem. But, people are aware now, suicides are up, and actually they've increased. Most recently, suicides of military veterans, and the fastest growing proportion of that population is the young vets are committing suicide. And so that has an impact. People see that when their cousin, someone in their community, their friend, commits suicide because of what they did in the military. People refer to it as a moral injury or a soldier's heart, the impact that it has on your humanity and the trauma. So I think all of these things, people are starting to see the reality of what it means to go to war, but also people are forced into that because they really literally can't find a job. I mean, my own children and their friends who are in their middle 20s, some of them have ended up taking jobs that are in the defense industry because they don't see other alternatives.
And I'll tell you, it's not just veterans who are committing suicide; it's active duty military and their their spouses. A report just came out in the last week about how that is increasing as well. So there's a lot of discontent when you're in the military and having to deal with the realities of what the U.S. does around the world. As far as the draft goes, Glenn Ford, who's the editor of Black Agenda Report, tells a really important story. He was in the military during the time period when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and he was sent to Washington, D.C. with his group in the military, and they were the black members said, we are not going to allow a black person to be harmed in these protests. We're not going to allow them to be, we're going to prevent them from being arrested. And he believes that the reaction to the troops who went to deal with the MLK protests, refusing to attack black protesters, was a signal that led to the end of the draft. They realized they could not control people who they drafted. They needed to find a way to recruit people. And as the recruitment now has gotten so bad that they're changing the levels of IQ and intelligence and grades, they're changing the weight limitations so that now people who are already on the verge of being obese are being put in the military. They are so desperate. And it's not just because of that, the realities of war. It's because there are people who are active in counter-recruitment efforts.
Right.
That's what I say. You don't always see the activism that's having an impact. But we know many people who've worked for years on counter-recruitment.
Right.
There are organizations set up for that purpose. And so they're having an impact, combined with the reality of military service and what it means and the impact of what U.S. wars do around the world. People don't want to be part of that kind of really insane. The kind of activity the U.S. does to destroy countries is insane. It's illegal, and it's coming to an end if we do our jobs.
Well, that's really a pernicious draft, as you mentioned, an economic draft to exploit the poorest people in the country. So is there anyone in an anti-war movement who favors bringing back a draft that would increase?
That does come up once in a while. People do say that, but they usually get argued down. People recognize that the draft really helped to energize the Vietnam War protests because so many people, so many families were affected. The lottery impacted everyone who was 18 years old. People watched the lottery, were worried about the lottery, so their friends get high numbers. And there are people who went into the military and then continue their anti-war efforts in the military, causing disruption in the military and during the Vietnam era. That was a very important part of the anti-war movement, was the soldiers who were fighting back against the war from within. And so, yeah, people do sometimes bring that up, but in the end, most people have the view that no, we can't be encouraging more people to go to war. We have to continue to fight and the anti-recruitment effort and build up the anti-war movement the best we can in the current environment we face. But we do not want more people going into war.
Is there anybody on Capitol Hill who wants a draft? Is there any talk at all about bringing it back?
I have not. There have been some who I'm trying to place who they are, but it has come up once in a while, but it's never gained any momentum.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on. I know you have to go, but I really find fascinating the issue of the media and all of this, and the impact that alternative media has, and why it's being why it could be a problem for the organizers of war, that organizers against war are influenced by a media and an alternative media that brings simply facts about what's going on in other countries and what the U.S. motives for war are, which of course are routinely covered up by corporate media, who cheerlead. I mean, one of the most disgusting episodes I remember experiencing was the lead up and then the coverage of the invasion of Iraq.
Well, of course, the New York Times ran Dick Cheney press releases as if they were actual news, without any kind of criticism. It really exposed the New York Times for what they are. But I think that you're right in your comment. We underestimate the people's media and the independent media, and we underestimate people's movements in the United States. Other countries in the world are smarter about that. They see the power of people's movements. In the United States, we underestimate it, and I hope that future shows from Consortium News will focus on the power of people's movements, because we are very powerful. We just have to understand our power and exercise it. So thank you for having us on to talk about these issues from that kind of perspective.
Absolutely. And Margaret, just wanted to underline one thing was really interesting and important you said was the way people in foreign countries are portrayed in the media, not from their own points of view, but how we think that they think. And by not giving a voice, let's say to the Palestinian people or North Korean people, they're just shut out. And therefore, it's the American people don't have an opportunity to form any kind of relationship or understanding that they're just human beings like we are. That makes it much easier to go to war against them, isn't it? When they are just a voiceless people out there who are somehow an obstacle to U.S. interests. So that was a very important point you made. Thank you both. Yes?
I was just going to quickly say that, we went to Iran in February of this year, and that's certainly a population that has been demonized, and found that the Iranians we met were the most hospitable, lovely people. We shared so much in common with them, but they've been dehumanized in the U.S. media. So, and we've had that experience really everywhere that we've traveled. So, yeah, thank you. That's a really important point.
Demonized just by being silenced. You don't even hear what they say. They're unimportant. They don't even exist. Well, thank you again, Margaret.
Thank you.
And Kevin Zeeze for joining us on this show about anti-war movement and the state of it. And thank you so much for the work you do, and again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on.